While Singapore remains subject to a 10% baseline tariff, even as US President Donald Trump imposes steeper levies on other countries. Deputy Prime Minister Gan Yong revealed that talks with Washington are ongoing, particularly over pharmaceutical trade. He also announced plans to visit the US this month to explore new ways to boost industry cooperation. Nadirah Zaidi tells us more.
Singapore has not yet received a letter from the US on higher tariffs, and so it's still subjected to the 10% baseline rate. Deputy Prime Minister Gan Yong says tariffs are here to stay, and Singapore must be prepared for a longer period of uncertainty.
On the whole, businesses have been preparing to adjust to the new tariff realities. Some have taken advantage of the ongoing pause in the reciprocal tariffs to front-load their exports to the US, and as a result, the economy is likely to hold up relatively well in the first half of this year. However, given the expectation of higher tariffs going forward, as well as the diminishing front-loading effect, we will likely see slower economic growth over the next 6 to 12 months.
With US President Donald Trump threatening a 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals, Mr. Gan says Singapore is in discussions with the Department of Commerce to understand their expectations and explore practical ways to facilitate trade in Singapore.
I can't go into details on the pharmaceuticals, as I mentioned. We are discussing with the Department of Commerce on how we can evolve a system, practices that are practical and implementable, because, as you know, pharmaceutical has a very complex supply chain and a very long supply chain. So how can we make sure that we are able to continue to facilitate the trade between Singapore and US?
Mr. Gan says negotiations over pharmaceutical tariffs will continue when he visits the US later this month, along with other items on his agenda.
The second area is to broader discussion with the U.S. administration to better understand their priorities, their interest areas, and to see whether there were opportunities for us to strengthen bilateral economic relationship, both on investment as well as trade, and also to look at the technology cooperation between our two countries.
While Singapore's inflation rate is expected to stay stable in the coming months, DPM Gan says tariffs could lead to higher costs for businesses and consumers over time.
And Singapore certainly not alone in its anxieties on tariffs. 8 members in ASEAN already hit with threats that will hit on the 1st of August if they do not get deals with Washington. Of course, foreign ministers of ASEAN meeting in Kuala Lumpur for more on the implications for the bloc as this meeting continues. And other key issues at this meeting, we're joined by Joanne Lin. She's Senior Fellow and Coordinator at the ASEAN Studies Centre at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Ms Lin, earlier on this bulletin, we were talking with our correspondents about the very tough task that US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has at this ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in a region where economic security is tantamount to national security. To say we are committed to the region even as your president is launching tariffs left, right, centre, this is a very tough message to sell.
Yes, thank you, Wei Su, for having me. I mean, you're right. I mean, this is a very big day for ASEAN because its foreign ministers has met with counterparts from 9 major partners, including the first-time attendee of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as you mentioned earlier. So at the U.S. ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, Rubio has really affirmed many things like ASEAN centrality and the region's importance to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and he has actually pledged deeper engagement in areas like trade, digital innovation, and maritime security, while calling also for joint efforts to combat transnational crime. And I believe that this will all be welcome, especially the U.S. role as a security balancer in the region and as a guarantee for some countries. But I guess that while the rhetoric, really struck the right tone, ASEAN leaders were quite clear, that action speaks louder than words. tariffs. And Washington's latest tariffs, including steeper rates for some countries like Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, have really stirred unease across the region. And ASEAN has actually expressed concern over the erosion of a stable rule-based trade and calling the tariffs as counterproductive and warning that they risk deepening global economic fragmentation. So I guess what ASEAN seeks now is really more consistency and predictability from its long-standing partner like the US.
Okay, Ms. Lin, until ASEAN gets there, what ASEAN can do, and we heard from ASEAN Chair Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim calling repeatedly for solidarity, coordination and unity on these threats on tariffs.
Yes.
So if actions speak louder than words, has ASEAN demonstrated by action that it is unified and coordinated in threats from Washington, certainly on trade?
Yeah, I think that's an important one. And I think ASEAN has made its collective outcomes or concerns clear. I think both ASEAN leaders and the economic ministers before this month has actually issued a joint statement responding to the tariffs and called for very strict adherence to open, rule-based and non-discriminatory trade principles. And these statements actually reflect ASEAN's desire to really resist the growing protectionist pressures, including, this latest wave of tariffs that we have seen and other sectorial tariffs as well on top of it. So, however, I would say that despite a very strong collective message, ASEAN actually lacks the institutional capacity to negotiate trade as a bloc, and unlike the EU, and it has no free trade agreement with the US. But however, Malaysia has taken the initiative to set up the Geo-Economic Task Force to respond to rising economic coercion and trade weaponization. So because of this, bilateral tariff talks with Washington amongst the different ASEAN members will be inevitable, but quite essential because ASEAN member states really have very different export structures, sectorial vulnerabilities, and also even the levels of economic resilience to the US. So, of course, bilateral engagement will also allow, countries to tailor their approach based on what they are willing to offer the US, whether is it like buying more of American products, reducing its own tariffs or non-tariff barriers, or even encouraging their national firms to invest or set up operations in the US. So these are all decisions that has to be made by ASEAN member states and not ASEAN as a whole.
But Ms. Lin, in a way, it's inevitable as well that if you reach a deal, so for example, in April, ASEAN pledged not to retaliate to these tariffs. That's one. And two, they pledged also that if they reached any bilateral deals, this would not be at the expense of ASEAN. But that is not something you can promise. So, for example, Vietnam's deal with the US, it's promised, according to Mr. Trump, 0 tariffs on all US exports into Vietnam. Now, Vietnam can afford to do that. As you say, maybe its trade portfolio is different, its risk exposure is different. But other countries have other red lines. They cannot promise 0 tariffs. This is just one example. So if Vietnam sets the benchmark for the kind of trade deals that the US can expect from Southeast Asia, and other countries cannot keep up with that, that harms any other country's position if it wants to negotiate with Washington.
Yeah, exactly. You are right. So, at the end of the day, as much as we want to see ASEAN as a common market and production base, there will still be competition amongst the different ASEAN member states. And because of the different, national priorities amongst them and the different sensitivity that they have, to different sectors, there is a no one-size-fits-all approach. Of course, they can always look at the successful countries, like in the case of Vietnam, learn a thing or two, and see how, they can, follow certain things. But whether, they are willing to remove 100% of the tariffs, if they have to protect their local sector like agriculture, whether they are able to remove 100% non-tariff barriers, especially if it relates to standards, national regulations, digital tax laws. I think that's really, another matter altogether, right? So, yes, we can learn from each other, but at the end of the day, certain decisions will still have to be made by individual countries.
Mr. Not just learn from each other. In fact, Mr. Anwar, just yesterday saying we need to fortify our internal foundations, referring to increasing, and there's a lot of potential for this intra-region ASEAN trade.
Yes, that's right. I think Prime Minister Anwar, at the opening ceremony of the meeting, he has said that ASEAN must do more to really boost internal trade, which is actually very low at the moment. He's not wrong. It's only about 22%, and that is really half of intra-EU trade. So the region definitely needs to double down on some practical economic integration measures, and that would include accelerating the harmonization of standards, reducing the non-tariff barriers and this very long-standing issue, and modernizing custom procedures, really among ASEAN member states. And maybe they should also improve the implementation of the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, the ATIGA, and really streamline, certain things like the rules of origin or certification. And that would really help to lower transaction costs and encourage companies to deepen production. But at the same time, I also feel that ASEAN must broaden its trade diversification strategy to really reduce over-reliance on any single major power. So middle powers like the EU, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and of course, all of them met with the ASEAN foreign ministers today. They actually present credible alternatives, both as markets and investment partners. And also, we saw that the recent ASEAN GCC China summit was really another signpost of how the global South is emerging as a critical space for South-South trade and investment flows. And, that's also one reason why ASEAN member states are really showing more interest in groupings like the BRICS. Of course, there might be certain repercussion like what Trump has threatened, right? The extra 10% tariffs on countries that support some anti-American policies.
Oh, that's thanks to Joanne Lin outlining what ASEAN can do. So diversification of trade partners and also putting more emphasis on practical measures to bolster trade within the region. Joanne Lin from the ASEAN Studies Centre at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute.